Welcome back, everybody, to the afternoon session of the African Ecological Architecture Symposium. For those of you who are just joining us, we have 3 sessions planned for this afternoon. The first is a project presentation by Sénamé, Koffi, Sitou Akolly, and Samenjo Tondo, and the session will be hosted by Charles Musyoki. The purpose of this session is to discuss tackling the question on the role of digital design and fabrication in the future of the continent. After that, we'll have a keynote session by Mokena Makeka of South Africa on public space design for Africa. And finally, a panel session on Afrofuturism. How does housing and infrastructure look like in 2063? So without further ado, I will hand the session over to Charles.
Thank you, Lillian. Good afternoon, everyone. So my name is Charles Musyoki. I'm from Kenya. I'm a recent graduate architect from the University of Nairobi here. And I recently completed a postgraduate course at the Institute of Advanced Architecture of Catalonia in 3D printing architecture. And I'll be your moderator for the discussion on the role of digital design and fabrication in the future of the continent. So increasingly, the reality between physical spaces and digital world is being redefined, and with the availability of technology and a move to digital spaces such as this. Digital fabrication seeks to seamlessly blend data from the design phase into shop drawings, and through a mechanized and industrialized construction process, design models become the basis for fabrication, giving dimension to ideas and creating a real-world experience that are immersive and interactive. So on to our panel for today. I'd like to introduce our first presenter. He's a PhD candidate at the Faculty of Industrial Design and Engineering at Delft University in Netherlands, where he also did his master's. His doctorate interest is in access to healthcare for all by circular design in sub-Saharan Africa. So, and his approach in product design has propelled him in developing a range of products that both meet meet human needs, including a project back in 2018 where he developed a 3D printer. I'd like to welcome Heinz Samenjo from Cameroon to take us.
Well, thanks, Jazz. Can I share my screen? Is it possible? Right. Yeah. Great. I'm going to share. Give me a few seconds to split this in full mode. Slideshow. Yeah, good. Thanks for the introduction, Charles. Once more, my name is Heinz. I am an illustrator designer here in the Netherlands, but I'm also focusing on doing work in Africa, well, in Kenya, Nigeria, Gabon, for now. And why I'm here, first of all, I'm not an architect, because I think this topic is mostly focused on architecture, but I'm just a designer. It's a global term in itself. And I'll be talking to you from a point of design or the industrial design perspective on how Africa can leverage on design and fabrication. And I'll be looking at examples and experiences of which I've been involved in the past. So just bear with me to walk through a few slides. Well, design in itself or fabrication is a global term used in many instances. And in this case, I'll be talking about 3D printing, in terms of design and manufacturing or fabrication. Just for context in this. Well, the question is, what is the future for digital design and fabrication in Africa? And from a point of research and science, we could say, well, it's about rapid prototyping, right? So we are trying to make our digital designs that we can quickly now prototype, but also manufacture. And in Africa, we're looking at more like, we're looking at how do we decentralize manufacturing in different instances. And from my perspective experiences, I think the future of this is how we can then bring rapid prototyping and manufacturing towards a more circular economy, right? In terms that the future should be looking at this. And how do we rapidly, generate and produce, or design to produce stuff that fits into our own ecosystem in Africa? And in most cases, is how do we prototype and manufacture products that can then support our ecosystem and be used for a longer period of time. And this is what I think it's the future of digital design and fabrication in the African context. I'll walk you through a few examples of what we've done so far by using an experience in the healthcare area, which is my focus in this setting. So, well, most of you might know that Africa has to face lots of healthcare issues in terms of access to medical devices, for example, which they are all indispensable to healthcare. I mean, healthcare needs medical devices. But we see that currently how we've designed and made medical devices is that they always end up either badly functional or obsolete. And then they end up as waste, right? So we as designers or architects, we spend time and design medical devices or products. And then they are used. And then over time, they become obsolete. And then they are discarded out of the ecosystem. Now, why are we doing this? Why are we putting effort to design stuff that they have a short lifespan of use and discarded? And I think right now, Africa should now begin to focus on how we can design and make products that can be used over a recurring period of times, and then end up still in the system where we still reuse them instead of being discarded off in the ecosystem. And that's why in 2018, I did co-founded a company called African Born 3D Printing, where we do manufacture 3D printers from recycled e-waste. And our goal was to continue to, provide manufacturing, space for the local designers that can produce long-lasting products that is used in our own context. And now our vision now in total as now a practical designer and a scientist is that how can we then leverage on digital design and fabrication methods to produce safe and affordable medical devices that is locally made in Africa, right? And 3, at the end, it reduce the impact of them being discarded into the environment. And that's what we're calling a Sacral Economy, which is to preserve products and their materials in the economic system. So we don't have to longer design products that are discarded, but they are conserved in the whole ecosystem in Africa. For example, this is just a few examples of what we've been developing. And most of what I'll show you right now is what is under clinical trials because they're medical devices, which we leverage on different digital tools that also use local manufacturing techniques like 3D printing, laser cutting to actually have a full-fledged device that is then put in the market, and it's a medical device. And we're leveraging on very, basic designs that can be rapidly produced with 3D printers that are also very effective and have a very fine finish. I mean, as a designer, we focus on very polished products. And if you're, aware of 3D printing, you see that they are challenging in terms of how you have a very fine finished product. But now we're leveraging on tools or AI systems that can then help us have a very polished, design that becomes a full-fledged, medical device that is launched in a hospital for now we're working with in Kenya. And secondly, you also see that we are also developing devices that are used on human beings, or they are very invasive, For example, this is a laryngoscope where it is 3D printed, but this device has to go into a human being to be able to see how they can open their mouth if they have oxygen shortages. So how do you leverage on tools like this to design and fabricate very precise and highly detailed medical devices? And we've been spending time in the last, few years to see how do we, leverage on simple design tools that are effective and use, very affordable fabrication tools as well to develop high-end products that are circular, meaning that they end up still being conserved or used over time in the economic system. Lastly, this is one of the devices that's also being under clinical trial right now in Kenya, and it's a simple extender. What it does is it simply extends the syringe so they can administer pain medication into the cervix during pregnancy or during miscarriages in women. Now, these devices are 3D printed, but they have to go through very rigorous medical laws and regulations. So how do you then leverage on, very simple design that require very basic fabrication tools for scale and still contribute mostly to healthcare in Africa? And so a few examples of what we've done so far in Kenya and Nigeria, for example. But in that, we've still faced lots of challenges. We keep talking about digital designs and fabrication, but we bring it in context in Africa. How do you leverage this for scale? How do you leverage digital fabrication techniques that can produce 10,000 copies a day? That's challenging, right? I mean, it's not just one design, one product you're going to put on the market. How do you then manufacture at scale? That if you have to produce 40 million copies, will you use 3D printers on that? Maybe, maybe not. I think it's one of our biggest challenges we're facing so far as a continent, that as we, keep on building on the idea of digital fabrication using 3D printing and others, they cannot serve the purpose of large-scale manufacturing yet. But I think with decentralized manufacturing techniques now, we are exploring, we are now seeing that if we have very many different, manufacturers that have the same or similar scale capacity, they can then together help us achieve, a large scale manufacturing techniques. But secondly, quality control. Digital fabrication can be centralized, used by anyone. You need a simple file sent to maybe a makerspace, it prints your medical device. But how do you guarantee quality control that two different, for example, makerspaces will produce the same medical device? I mean, if you're familiar with 3D printing, the same printers will produce different outcomes of the same device. So how do you take your product to, for example, the CE or FDA in America and say they have different, print layers? It's not the same device then. So we still have to see how we ensure that whatever we use to design our product and services, we need to ensure that they can pass through quality control, or else they all end up as ideas and shelved in our makerspaces. And lastly, regulations. Over the last few years, we've developed many devices, but surprisingly, these devices did not go past the prototype stage, because once it gets to market, this device have to go through very rigorous regulations. Well, for medical devices, it's crazy, because you have to go through about 6 different bodies to get a medical device even tested. And this is one thing that we are not aware of as we still talk about digital fabrication and designs. As we do all the back end stuff, there's a lot of things in the future we have to think about, which is one of them is regulations, because we have to go through, like, for example, in Kenya, the KEBS, capable of standard. They will not give you a certification for your device if you don't ensure that it is well manufactured, have quality control, and suits the market, right? And I think it's a key things that we are not looking at in Africa. And Africa as a continent needs to, in itself, begin to build this, because this one will support now how we leverage on digital fabrications and all techniques as well. And to just wrap up this, I would say when designing, fabricating, it's always key to remember, ask ourselves, like, how can we design and fabricate that we can still contribute to circular economy possibilities? because I think for us as in the African context, we have the opportunity to reshape how we design and fabricate, because we are still in our early stages of design fabrication. So how do we begin to make sure that we do not, misuse our resources, which we will not be able to have them in the future? And I think for me, this is one of the key areas or the future of digital fabrication in Africa. For more of what we do, you can check up our website. We have lots of details in terms of practice and science that you can read on for your own time. Thank you.
Thank you, Samenjo, for that insightful presentation. I'd like to move on to our next speaker. He's a Togolese American who grew up in California, where he studied at the California College of Arts, attaining degrees in Masters in Robotics, Digital Craft, and Masters in Theory and History of Architecture form. And in addition to this, in 2017, he obtained a scholarship from the IE, Architecture School of Architecture and Design in Madrid, where he completed his third master's degree in strategic design of spaces. He's currently based in Amsterdam, Netherlands, working with Studio Craft and previously UN Studio as a computational designer. He's also an avid student of culture with his background, and he humbly embodies an us with them paradigm in design thinking in his work in the multidisciplinary creative fields of architecture, rapid prototyping, fashion, and curatorial practices. I'd like to welcome Sitou Akolly to take us through his presentation.
Thank you so much. Can everyone hear me well? Or yeah, can I get a yes? Can I get a yes?
Yes, we can hear you.
Perfect. All right, cool. Thank you for the introduction again. My name is Sitou Akolly. Togolese by nationality, raised in California, where I went to uni, and then I moved to Madrid for another journey for school. And now I find myself in Amsterdam, the Netherlands, in the past 5 years now, where I've worked at UN Studio, which is a multidisciplinary architecture office. My main focus there was a computational designer, which is kind of being able to support our architecture team with rationalization of architecture in a sense. And as of a couple of months ago, I transitioned to Studio Drift, which is more of an art, still parametric and computational studio that focuses on art and public spaces. Some of the other stuff I've done was just kind of being visitor professor at different universities I already have affiliation with. But today I would just talk about my side of the journey with architecture and the diaspora. And I'll start with first educational work. And so when I was in California, I focused on basically with a team of 2, we've created this robot machine that would print architecture in a sense. And so the process for that was to, first we had to study materials because it's something that was new in a way, but also different in the sense that we were printing at a bigger scale. So things like viscosity of a material, the aggregates that needs to be in the compound and so on were very important. And so we took a couple of weeks of just doing material research. And then the second phase was to develop this machine, this robot in some way, that will have the intelligence of printing in 3 dimensions. And so we understood we had to build 2 different axes, one that goes in the Y and X and one that goes in the Z. The Z is basically upside down. And so from that, we've kind of, just came up with a prototype of what it could feel like or what would it be to design architecture through a machine. And some of the research that went behind this was also following some of the indigenous way of constructing architecture in Africa back then, which is basically laying in mud, raw earth in a circular shape because it has the strongest structural stability than any other shape. If you make rectangles, then the corners would kind of break. So we took on that notion that were passed on by our forefathers and try to apply it with the new tools and the new way of designing space. So that was that part of the project. Secondly, I started focusing a bit on how to take data and translate it into the way we design space or a city. And so this kind of computational program I have here was just testing, going from one direction to another, what would be the cues based on your viewpoint, but also on the height of the different buildings within the space, in order to design ways to, in some way, curate the way people move through space. Meaning, if you go outside, maybe you might be inclined to go to the park because you understand the park is close to you, but on the way to the park, you maybe stop at a coffee shop, which is just has a good visual cue for you. So it's understanding how things are placed within a city in order to affect the experience of a space or a city. And so with this type of computational practice or way of testing how we design, we can already create a layer of data that gives us an idea of how people actually use a space, right? And this can be applied to not just how you use space, but how you use your house. I remember when Corona happened, some of the things we were doing was to understand how much time I spent in a specific room and how much time I spent in my bedroom versus my living room. And because everything was working from home, you understand that a person like us will spend more time in their living room because they're always on the computer or going to school or doing their meetings from their bedroom. So with that aspect of knowing how you use a space, you can kind of alter the way you behave in order to create the most optimal way of living, in a sense. While I was doing my thesis, I've also written a book, in some sense, that focused on West African colonial history, specifically Togo, where I'm from. Some of that urge came because moving to the US, one thing you realize is the architecture is quite predominant. And one thing I started understanding is that Togo, for example, does have some architectural identity, but it's not well spoken of or well documented. And so with that time I have an opportunity I had, I wanted to study that a bit better and to understand what were the shift from the colonial time to what it is now. And eventually that led to being published in the Architectural Guide, Sub-Saharan, where it was a compilation of different architects and different work on the diaspora that gives a bit an idea of the history of the architecture and how we're moving forward. That aside, I've done a lot of artistic exhibitions and curation, all still focused on a way of abstracting geometry to create something that is different from what we know. This one you see is String Garden in collaboration with Andrew Cutlass, which focused on taking vinyl sheets. These are wooden sheets in some way that we kind of folded together, as you can see in the process, to create these shapes, to kind of replicate this idea of roots. And this was exhibited in Miami, I think in 2015. Furthermore, with the computational side, we've worked on these installations that allow to kind of mitigate the way people move through space. In this sense, we've used sensors and light. And so this was placed in a college and a university in California, where based on the traffic that happens in the hallway, the light would dim or they would get brighter. And so these were kind of small exercises that essentially were able to, again, speak again on how people move through space or how people experience space. These are some of the drawings for it. And then we've done this little park that focused on educating the neighborhood on healthy living and healthy foods. And so with wood, we just basically scanned a bunch of like, fruits or vegetables or nuts and kind of create a 3D object out of it. This was quite successful. And then personal work, what I focus on is understanding how to change the way we see architecture. Because I think one of the priorities I would like to take on is to design architecture a bit differently than how it's done in West Africa at the moment. So a lot of the work I will show, I will go through them fast so I don't take too much time. I'm focusing on kind of creating a different identity of architecture where we take something that's familiar and we flip it upside down to see what kind of space come out of these. Understanding the notion of primitive shapes and way of creating community, a collective. some studies of iconography, where I was taking the icons of the Batamaliba huts, which is that of the roof, but superimposing it with that of the church and that of the educational system, and just to kind of come up with different architecture archetypes of space or design. And these are things I was kind of passionate about as looking into, because I think these are quite interesting, some of the findings that come out of them. And again, data is always a huge thing for me. So understanding how to take data and design space for that. I'll keep going fast. Again, this is all about, if we were to design an Afrofuturism, what would that space look like? So taking one primitive and multiplying over time to just understand what type of form and shapes come out of it. Yeah, again, this idea of coding encounters, which is programming intelligence into form in order to create kind of arbitrary shape or design that could potentially lead to something useful. And this is kind of the making of a tower, for example. Again, looking in alternative indigeneity, which is taking on familiar African aesthetic and adding it into something that's a bit more parametric and a bit more odd and strange. Just again, to always question how we see architecture now and how we can evolve in the future. And finally, understanding how, again, taking on, architectural elements and understanding how these things can play in a way we design space in some sense. So again, I think that will conclude it. Most of my focus was always to take geometry and form and understanding how we can create something different from what we are used to. I hope that wasn't too fast. If it is, we'll answer some of this question during the Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you, Sitou, for that presentation.
Of course.
It's interesting to see the bloodline between the data and physical manifestation. Yeah. So next up, our next speaker is also from Togo, an independent researcher, architect, and anthropologist who studied at the Parisian School of La Villette in France and runs his own practice, the Afrikan Architecte. He's the founder of WOLAB in Lomé, Togo, a network of innovation spaces covering Lomo and potentially other West African cities, with a long-term vision of 1,000 labs in Lomé that work as innovation spaces and a grid that can serve as infrastructure to steer development. That is in training a big number of smart citizens that can tackle challenges and drive change in the neighborhood through entrepreneurial solutions. This was made fast manifest through the first African-made 3D printer out of electronic waste in 2013. I'd like to welcome Sénamé Koffi to take us through his work.
Thank you. Do you hear me? Thank you for the invitation. How much time do I have?
10 minutes.
We have until 4 p.m. for this
Sorry?
session. So.
Sorry?
Sénamé, we have until 4 p.m. for this session. So if you have a presentation of about 10 minutes, that would be great.
Okay. Okay, thank you. It's short but I will try to synthesize, combine 20 years commitment in earth architecture and 10 years in digital fabrication. But this presentation will be more like a sharing of an album photo. So if I am too long, do not hesitate to stop me. And I apologize first for my English, who is disastrous. So let's go. I'm sure you are all aware of the challenges of the future of Africa. In this continent, as you know, the 5 biggest cities in the world in the history of the humans will pop up till 2050. So it is a big challenge for the future of the continent. And one aspect of the challenge is not the only one, but one aspect is the quick building and massive building of housing and infrastructure. And the answer to that for the moment is what our policymaker try to push is the smart city. You have a lot of sexy smart city projects who are launched right now, like everywhere in Africa. And yes, so I have a lot try to make a critique of those smart city projects, but the main critique I would like to tell about today is the fact that if we do those type of smart city as the big tech are pushing it, we are facing this problem to establish a sort of big infrastructure for a new colonialism, in this sense that the smart city can become a sort of biggest pipeline you can imagine for your data, as Africa will host like the third of the humanity in the few years. So the first project I would like to share with you is the Fcd project we are pushing till 2012. The idea with this project is to create an alternative smart city approach by replicating Fab Labs all over the city, and each Fab Lab have this contract to transform his neighborhood 1 kilometer around it in a smart neighborhood by developing all the technology needed for this objective. In the sense that if you have a Fab Lab each 2 kilometers, you have a network of space of resources who can help to create a sort of bottom-up smart city. So it is a self-funded project we are continuing to pushing. And lastly, we add a new element to this with our own DAO. So those of you who are familiar with Web3 and interested in it, I invite you to check the FCT DAO, which is a new elements we develop right now to try to push this project further. But I think today the discussion is most about architecture. So yes, there is also a big lot of question about the production of the future African cities. Should we move with those examples? Here you have Dakar. Or can we develop something like this, but more contemporary and who try to recycle all the quality of this type of concept in terms of performance in materials and the way of living. But before trying to advocate vernacular architecture, we need to understand what is the importance of vernacular architecture. And I would like to highlight one aspect of the importance of the vernacular architecture by telling you a little bit about this example. Here you have the structure of a Bororo village, Bororo people you find in America, and it is a society Claude Lévi-Strauss worked in. And he make a very good testimony about the fact that in the traditional configuration, the family house in Bororo societies delimit a cycle around the house of men who meet at middle, and the villages is separated in 2 exogamic groups by this main path. So individuals still belongs to the same society, one half, but have to marry in another half. So what I would like to say is that the configuration of the village, the architecture importance is that he regulates everything, the marriage and all the aspects of the living in these type of societies. And Lévi-Strauss revealed that the missionaries who understood the efficiency of this system for being able to convert Boro people to Christianism, decided to move them to a village to another, so that they lose all their cardinal rebirth and all this very interesting paradigm who can help them to be really linked to their tradition. So the architecture itself in traditional societies, and it is the case for still most of our area in Africa, have a very non-measurable importance who we need to try to maintain, even if we need to go forward in the modernity. And to try to understand very well what is embedded in our traditional architecture, I began this work 20 years ago to try to isolate all the principles and all the concepts in our traditional architecture, who seems to be, I don't know how to say it, permanent, non-depending on the society you are in Africa, you see the same principle. And I isolate 8 principles, which are like the DNA of African traditional architecture, African Negro traditional architecture. And the architecture itself can change in terms of shape, but you'll see that the principle still remains, so that the principle work really like a DNA. You can combine them differently to give you different type of aesthetics, but the ethics those principles take in charge can remain. So just to share with you some of those principles quickly, because we don't have a lot of time. You have the gestation principle. You still have in our traditional architecture an element. It can be spatial or it can be just symbolic, who have this objective to remain the idea of giving birth, Another principle is the anthropomorphism. Our houses still have all the attributes of the humans, a head, legs, etc., etc. You have the duration principle. The plan is still circular, and the organization itself is circular. You have another principle most known, which is the fractal, and Ron and Blash make a very good work to highlight this. But we have those other principles like panoptic, this idea of inextricability, etc., etc. So if we lose the shape, the danger is to lose also those principles. And those principles' importance are very huge, because the idea is, by example, taken charge by the anthropomorphism, is to give the idea that an architecture or a building is not something neutral. It's like a parent of in your family, Tambema people, Sitou talk about, by example, consider that the house is the old mother of the community. So if you come in a Tambema community, you have to greet the house first before greet people who are in the house. And if I want to leave you and go back to house, I say I have to go to see my mother, talking about the house itself. So this non-neutrality of the architecture is linked to those principles, and it is those principles here you have to give you a panel of different shape. You have Musgoum in Chad region, Cameroon, north of Cameroon and Chad region. You have Moudon, still in Chad region. And you see that the architecture are can seem very different, but they have the same preoccupation in terms of concept, principle, symbolic, etc. Here you have Tambema people at the north of Togo and Benin. So yes, it is the first thing I would like to make you aware of, that you have this principle. And this principle, what is very interesting is that you can relate them to very actual preoccupation. By example, what I'm talking about by saying figure de gestation, the fact that you have idea of birth is in those societies very close to what we call today sustainable. It is the idea that everything you are doing, you can't do it only for people who are already there. You need to think about people who will come after you. So you have these contracts with the generation who will follow, so that everything you are doing will not interfere or be negative for the people who follow. And you can make a correspondence with all those 8 principles who seems to be important in our traditional architecture, in our new modern conversation about sustainability, egalitarianism, etc., etc. So that, in the sense that if we find a way to maintain those principles in our very modern and contemporary way of living, we will, by the same way, we can address the very difficulties we have with our modernity today and all this misery of our modernity. This idea of trying to preserve the vernacular have his pioneer, and 2 of them I'm very close to in terms of practice are Hassan Fati and Fabrizio Carola, who is my master, who trained me. And what was the difficulties for those one, and even for me, is the fact that even if you try to maintain the traditional way of building or traditional canon, traditional aesthetics, you can do it at the scale. You are limited. You can make a school somewhere, but even by making some small projects, you can really be radical in terms of aesthetic and try to be close to our traditional aesthetic. But because you have this constraints of this modern parallelism, quadrangular industry system, who is now hegemonic, So there was a limit for people like me who try to push the tradition into a form of modernity. Here is a project still in Tambema. It's my very first experience as architect, building a school for 200 kids in Tambema region. And what I would like to see right now is the proximity between the way during the first day of building, when they make the ritual tradition, and what you can do with the very first layer of 3D printing. So 3D printing, if you follow me very well, is a solution right now to try to reconquer our old canon, these very complex shapes we have in our traditional architecture, and that we can maintain if you want to build at scale in the modern industrial way of building. So it is the first indication that fabrication, digital fabrication, it is a paradox, because it is a very advanced technology you can consider, but it's very close of the way it can help to be close of the way of very traditional societies used to build. But we need to quickly adopt those technologies, because if I take the example of Tambema societies, you don't build your house with an expert. You have some very professional mason you invite, who is the chief of the work, but you build your house with all the village. So each house is built with all the village. So in this sense that you don't have any property, everybody have this responsibility to host everybody, because your house was built by the whole community. So through the 3D printing, by example, to achieve his potential to become a tool to help to reconquer the modernity of our traditional canon, we don't just take it for this potential he have to maintain the aesthetics. We also need to civilize this technology so that it can be used in this collaborative way and not become a common technology in the hands of a company, and that you pay for build your house for you, so that every act of building stay a possibility to build a community around the house. And it is this challenge we try to address with Wella since 2012 by taking this signal of Fab Labs and put it quickly in Africa and try to create our own approach of Fab Lab, which can be a sort of renew of the way our traditional societies used to see the fabrication. And of course, one of our first achievement was the 3D printer made in e-waste. And we was awarded for one of the very first projects talking about putting 3D printer on Mars to build habitable for the colonization of this planet by the NASA Space Sat Challenge. And also awarded with the same 3D printer project at the Fab 10 in Barcelona. I think 2014. So just to finish, I will just share with you some project. This project, by example, I done with Manuel Berger, is to try to synthesize all those 8 principles I talked about in a picto and use it like a tool you can combine differently and who can help to build different architecture, who can be very original, but who share the same DNA. Another project Sitou can relate to, which is a project based on the Tamberma architecture plan. It's supposed to be a micro-pedagogical architecture for the Biennale in Venice, the last Biennale, but I can't do it because of the Corona crisis. And it was also an homage to a very interesting guy called Aldo van Eyck. I invite you to check, which is one of the pioneers of this renew of the anthropological paradigm in architecture. Others projects, just some projects in Togo we are working on right now who can mobilize 3D printing, just to finish. The project of school with some elements who can be 3D prints, and we are trying right now to have a partner to help for that. If not, we'll do it in a low non-tech approach, but the best will be to print so that we can test the capacity of those technology to build schools quickly at the scale. Another project, which is a cultural center still in Togo, with a lot of elements who can be 3D prints. New project we are working on also right now with some elements we can 3D print, but what we are thinking about to do it in wood and copper in very non-tech way of building. And maybe last project, which is very interesting project because this project is pushed by the community of Vodou priests to build a space who can host objects the West could restitute, objects connected to Vodou tradition, etc., etc. And for all those projects, we use this idea to combine the principle I'm talking about right now and what miss is this tool to build by we maintain the originality of African canon. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Sénamé, for your presentation. yeah, it's interesting to see the integration of culture with in the projects that you do. So very quickly, I'd just like to do a brief Q&A session because we're short of time. So the first question I'd like to ask is to Samenjo. So in your experience as a product designer and in the wave of innovations that has happened in the continent, what would you say are the roles that artificial intelligence innovations play in digital design and fabrication?
Well, I'm not an AI expert in the first place, so I will try to give you my answer based on my common knowledge of AI, right? Because this could also be a very big topic to discuss in another session. Well, AI could be much, needed to do some sort of predictive design, right? For example, in my field, there's lots of things we need to consider before we design, and AI can help you gather them and then begin to see how they're useful and where they're useful, right? And I think this is a very key thing that could be important for Africa as a continent, but I always have my reservations in this AI, because I always have, what is the need that Africa is looking for that AI can solve, right? Is it to predict, is it for efficiency? Can it help us, become more efficient, how we use resources? And I think it's many things. But for now, I think in my experience, it's mostly to make the use of either products or design efficient in itself. Well, do we have the capacity and infrastructure for that to happen? Maybe not yet. I think in the future, it could really help us see how we begin to have efficiency in our designs as we do it. Well, it might feel in healthcare, like how architects build hospitals. How can it be smart that we can then help people predict where they should go, where they should be at some time in the healthcare center, right? And how do we do that? And I think AI can help us when you see how we get our data that help us understand how we distribute patients in hospitals in different areas. Medical devices that can then, diagnose a disease easily. For example, in our device we design, we use AI to rapidly diagnose diseases. For example, in Nigeria, we use AI system to use on blood to diagnose very different diseases. For example, malaria and other diseases at the same time. That's AI being applied. But that's still very in its early stages. I mean, it's something that has to be developed over time and implemented. And it has use. But I always go back to the question, what is African looking that AI can solve? Because that's where I always start. Because it's there, but how do we use it? It's based on what we need to do. So we should always solve with them. Yeah.
Okay, thank you for your input. Maybe I'd like to get Situ's intake on this, experiences in computational design.
I think for me, similar to Samenjo, which is, in some way I will answer it that way to say, yeah, of course, AI could be very useful in the way we kind of create efficiency in the way we do things. But at the same time, if you look at West Africa history, in some way, efficiency was never the root of the things we did, right? We did things based on culture and based on community and feelings. And that's something that I think needs to be there as a foundation first. For me, I'm a bit out there, but I would even want to get rid of AI, because in some way, AI is also a form of colonization in a sense. It's not something programmed by us. But if we can find a different way to approach intelligence in a sense, that could be useful. In a way, if we can use AI to just map out the way architecture was designed then, because we appreciate it so much and it lasts so long, and with the same amount of data translated into what we are now, I wonder what kind of result will come out of that. So in some way, for the explorative spirit of design in general, I think AI is quite useful in that sense. But I think at the end of the day, it would be nice if we can come up with something that's a different way of thinking or a different way of making that's different from that of artificial intelligence in a sense. That would be my answer.
Thank you. So next question I'd like to ask is, I'd like to point this to you, Sitou, still. And I'd like to merge this with a question from the chat by Combate. So Combate asks, he's also Togolese in Kara, and he would like to know your major contribution as an architect to bring Togolese people to be able to identify themselves with a framework of architectural identity. And I'd like to also slot in what design and fabrication technologies are easily deployable in the continent.
Yeah, I'm also curious in what Samenjo and Sénamé thinks about this, because I think they are doing similar work as well. For me, by the way, great question. I don't know. I think this is what we're all doing here, right? I think not just the panel, but those guys who are also present in the audience. Obviously, we're here because we see potential or an opportunity to do something different from what we see now. And I don't think it has a specific form or shape. I think for me, when I did 4 years of architecture here in the Netherlands, where most of the projects were quite international, and once you get to that space of practice, then you realize a lot of things are very political and has less to do with life in a sense. And it was a good realization, because when I was, studying architecture back then, it was never, the urban fabric itself was not based on, in some way, was not based on taxation or land value or so on. It was very primitive to either natural threats or ethnic threats that are happening. So in a sense, my contribution is my knowledge from my research. And for me, I took on the idea of taking the tools that are available to us, kind of similar to what Sénamé is doing with the recycled technology, is to take those tools and explore as much as possible what we can do with it. Not the way it's been done in the Western world or in the Eastern world, but to take the tools and learn from the making of them and their potential, and to really apply that in the way we do things. So I think through knowledge sharing, having these lectures are great, because part of that is disseminating knowledge, but it's also being explorative in a sense. I think following the footstep of that of Samenjo, who started his own business, and Sénamé as well, who've taken their own expertise and find a way to apply within the context of Africa. I think that's a great way to start engaging that type of conversation. But it doesn't have a form or shape. It can be anything from medical to rapid fabrication. So that would be my answer. Just find something you're passionate about and share it with everyone.
Yeah, thank you for your feedback. Yeah, I'd also be curious to know Sénamé's thoughts on this, given your experience with Wode Lab and in the work you've shared with us. Just to answer Combate's question.
The question is how can be my major contribution as architect? Yeah. To
better identify.
You know me, and I don't like to live with frustration, so I'm doing. I'm already contributed in an environment which is not favorable, and I finance myself my concepts. I'm self-funded since 10 years, and I do. If I can do just a little with this position, I do a little, but you just need to begin somewhere, and
the answer is to do. Yeah, thank you very much. Let me just take, there's a question also from Kumbate. Where he asked how to deal. So he mentions the trend in concrete building, especially in 3D printing construction. And he points out to the disappearing African ecological architecture. So I'd also like to paraphrase it and ask, how could the digitization of vernacular material be streamlined for this day and age? This is to Sénamé.
No, I don't think it's the digitalization of materials. You need to make the material, you need to adapt the material, but it is the process which is digitalized, you know. And with 3D printing, it is a fact that you have more potential in terms of material you can use, because it is a way of building by adding and but by adding a fluid element. So that creates space to think about building in earth, and so to be close with our traditional way of seeing architecture.
Yeah. Thank you.
I could add to that as well, actually. Yeah, I think even in the whole idea of the concrete, just like Sénamé said, I think these are a type of infrastructures that also need to start growing in West Africa in order for the technology and digital aspect to kind of be at the height it is in other countries. There needs to be material research that focus on earth material to make sure earth material can be as strong and operate the same way as concrete, for example. Until it's to that level and to that level of availability, it will be hard for it to be mass produced, and which is a shame, because then it reduces architecture that we see to be mostly made out of concrete or wood. So I think it's just a matter of really pushing, this field as well in order to get, smart and innovative earth material at a manufacturing level, because then, yeah, there's a proof that there's a material that can compete with concrete.
Yeah, thank you very much for that. Yeah, we had some interesting discussions on this in the earlier panels. So there's some move in that direction also. So because we're short on time, I just one last question here from Carolina, where she asked how we can democratize these practices, like in 3D printing. And is 3D printing the highway to a better, fairer, and faster architecture practice? Yeah, let Sénamé just expand on this because of or Samenjo, just based on the work you've been doing.
Well, I mean, the word democratize, I'm not sure what they mean by that. 3D printing is available for everyone. If you need a 3D printer, you can buy it off the shelf, right? And that's already available. But the thing is, there are bottlenecks to that. The skills to design 3D printed, objects is needed. Also, the setup for what you want to do with it is needed. So it's available to everyone. It's just what you need to do with 3D printing, right? In this case, maybe architects is to design or make a house or a building. For me, it's to prototype, my medical devices. It's available. But I think on large scale, 3D printing could be the bottleneck because they're very expensive machineries, right? Which is still under development in most cases. I mean, the high-end ones will cost you more than 10,000 euros for a piece of 3D printers. That itself, it's an expensive machine. So that could be a bottleneck. But I think they are really available in large scales. I mean, I've been to very many countries, in Africa, and I've been able to find a 3D printer in a makerspace or two to use them. But now the issue is, how do you apply them? In what scale and what context is then what needs to be rethink by us, the Africans, not someone else. I guess in that case. So I would say it's probably already democratized. You just need to put your hands on it and then use it for your own context as we wish. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you for that input. Yeah, and I think even in just looking at the work that you guys are doing, we can be able to learn more, like with Sénamé and the Wode Lab, and just democratizing and getting people to learn more about the technique. Yeah, it's the way to go. So I'd like to pass on the discussion to the symposium moderators, and thank you very much for